This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Oh, great. Well, good afternoon. How many of the folks were, I recognize some of you from last night. How many were here last night? So, oh, good. So we know where we start, right? Okay, what we've got is, we've received some 50 questions. So you figure if we spend like an hour on each one of them, oh no, we probably better go a little faster than that. But there's some general areas that they break into. And the first one is said, would you make a couple of comments on the video, Democracy and Spirituality, which we were supposed to have heard today? Well, the first comment is I had it sent to the wrong address. What it was, I had an address in my book for Jordan that I put down there, and it turns out to be a little townhouse that he had when he first got here years ago, and it was from my old notes. And so when my office called me, I was out on the road. I was in Washington, D.C., and I was flying back in, and at an airport, they said, well, what's the address we send it to? So I just gave him his old address, and so it's sitting over there. But the actual video itself was an address I gave earlier this year to IONS, the Institute of Noetic Science in Southern California. They were gathering together to have a conversation, they said, about actions that would really make a difference, about issues that really mattered. And so they wanted to have that kind of a focus, so they asked me to come together to meet with them and kind of identify what I thought were a number of the key issues that I thought they ought to be directing their attention to during the course of the week they were going to be together down there. And what I did briefly was I just said, look, one of the ways to do this is to try to put ourselves in a position of people 100 years from now who were getting together and saying that, look, if we now could talk to the people back then who said they wanted to get together to talk about things they could do to make a real difference, about issues that really mattered, what would be the things that we would need to be talking about here in these few days that we have together, rather than all of the candidates that you're probably going to talk about. And at that point, I sort of started talking in terms of if I were the person coming back 100 years from now and found myself in the room with you, you'd say things like, why didn't you do anything about this global warming? Here we are, we're living in complete devastation here. We've lost half of all the potable drinking water on the planet. And was it that you guys didn't know about that? That you hadn't heard about that? That you didn't know what was happening or something like that? And what are you going to say? That, well, we had a bad president there and there wasn't anything we could do about it. What kind of an answer is that? What would you think if you got a chance yourself to go back and talk to people in 1920 in Germany? Didn't you notice what was happening there? Didn't hear about it or something? And so I was talking like that, and saying that, look, if you're actually going to take the time to come together, and you're open to the issues of the noetic sciences, the access to another way of knowing through the intuitive exercise of our new faculty, what is it you should be talking about? And so I reviewed a number of the issues, the potential coming thermonuclear war between the Northern Industrial Alliance and China, the new rising Asian empire. And so I talked about that because that the fact is that between 2012 and 2020, that's going to be a very major issue confronting us unless we mobilize and intervene very aggressively and keep this from happening. Because John Kerry is just kind of getting ready to kind of blithely go along doing this, thinking that it's just a natural carrying out of his big point of that, we didn't adequately consult our allies, in the invasion of Iraq. And since that's playing so well right now, He figures that if he just carries that right on into its fullest theme, well, why don't we just all join together with all of our allies and form one big, happy Caucasian union, that's where he'll go to. That's the kind of natural dynamic of all of that. So I had raised that with them, and that was the video that they had said, why don't you send that one down, and we'll take a look at it as an introduction. So that's what it was, but that we touched upon some of those issues last night so that you know what those are. And then it says here, who will win the election on November 2nd? I'm concerned because all of the pundits are saying that it's neck and neck right now. And the fact is, it's important to remember that the polls that are being done now are actually polling the people who have been registered for at least 3 elections, who voted in all of those elections so that they believe that there's an 85% or better probability that they're going to vote this time. They're polling these people to try to get their information. The fact of the matter is they're not polling a lot of the younger people, a lot of the black people, a lot of the Hispanic people, a lot of the people that are fairly natural constituencies for the Democratic Party. And so they're leaving out a lot of these people. And they will more or less acknowledge that if you challenge them on those numbers. You say, well, but wait a second, given the criteria you're using for who you're polling, aren't you missing the whole numbers of people that have been newly registered and have never really voted before? You know, including a whole lot of people in the boomer generation who just basically never thought it was worthwhile voting for one of these two parties. And you don't have any real idea anymore about who the people were that voted for Nader last time that are the progressives. You don't know whether they're really going to vote for Nader again or whether they're not. You haven't talked about the fact that Nader himself has said that in certain swing states like Oregon and like in Pennsylvania and in Florida and Colorado and Wisconsin, that he has specifically said that people who would support him should in fact vote for Kerry. I mean, he's actually said that. No, yeah, I know, but people could write him in, and so the bottom line is that I believe, as I said last night, that what we're going to see is not only are Kerry and Edwards going to win on next Tuesday, but they're going to win by a much larger percentage than people thought, thereby getting past this problem of having big protracted litigation, and the Republicans are going to hold their breath until they turn blue and wait until they can get it in the hands of the Supreme Court again, and get it there as fast as they can and assume the Democratic Party will give in again, like they did. So I don't believe that that's going to happen. As I said last night, I believe that we're going to see something in the area of a 52-47 split on this election. I think we're going to see a lot of the votes for Nader coming out of California and coming out of New York and coming out of the places where, in Massachusetts, where there's going to be basically an overwhelming majority of people are going to vote for Kerry and Edwards anyhow. And so they're going to definitely get the electoral votes. So when the popular vote comes out of their popular vote total, it isn't going to affect the electoral vote really in much of a way at all. And I think that's where the 1% to maybe 1.5% of the popular votes that are going to come in for Nader, which will be less than he got last time, are going to come from. Then probably about 9 states will have probably 95% of all the votes for Nader. There's a very interesting, I should point this out, there's a very interesting fact that people don't really know much about when it has to do with the Senate race that's going on now. One of the big issues is will the Democrats conceivably take the Senate back? The argument is that they have to hold the seat that Dan Graham had in Florida, they have to hold the seat in South Carolina, and they have to hold the seat that John Edwards is leaving in North Carolina, and they believe that that's going to happen. And then the Democrats are going to win the seat in Illinois, take that, and there's a chance they'll win the seat in Colorado. So that's the way in which that might happen. But with regard to the Senate, it's extremely important to understand, and it's kind of a complex statistic, but I just want to share it with you because it struck me so much when I realized this, is that because of the way the United States government is set up, where the Senate has 2 representatives from every state, no matter how small they are, so that North Dakota, for example, has 2 United States senators, and the state of California has 2 United States senators. It turns out that the states the number of states that control 51 of the 100 United States senators. The states that control 51 of the 100 United States senators, therefore controlling the majority of the United States Senate, have only 18% of the population in the United States. And it turns out that the 9 states in the United States that contain 55% of all of the population have only 18% of the United States senators. So what you have is you have a one of the two bodies, and people say, that doesn't seem to represent the people at all. But as I pointed out last night, it was never intended to. It represents the landed aristocracy in their interests. And so therefore they can access that kind of power and they can control that body a lot more easily. And so it's just it's a piece that we need to understand, that our polity as we have it actually organized right now is not ideal. So that there's going to be a substantial work that we need to do as the largest and best educated generation in history, in alliance with the newest, second largest generation in history and the second best educated generation in history. And if we do our job, they will become the best educated generation in history, better than we. That this alliance has a lot of work to do in trying to figure out how to generate and create an ideal government. Because the fact of the matter is, as much as we all deny it, in actually another 50 years, virtually all of us will be gone, or wherever it is that we go. And that therefore we will have had our pass at it this time. We will have had our 85 to 100 years here. And so that we're at that point right now where there's an extraordinarily interesting thing happening right now. And this is another thing I wanted to share with you. That what I believe is going on is something very similar to what was discussed by William Strauss and Neil Howe, people that you virtually never heard of before. But they're two major scholars, one from Yale, one from Harvard, that did a major study. They were both at Notre Dame University. And they said, that in any given century of 100 years, we basically have 4 generations that occur within this 100-year period. And what they did is they began to suspect that there might be some sort of pattern of relationship that the 4 generations that exist within each 100-year period end up having with each other. For example, you in your own generation, we in our own generation, we know a lot of the members of our parents' generation, but we know almost none of the people in our grandparents' generation. We know virtually kind of a tiny handful of people that were in that entire generation. And while we know a lot of the people that are in our children's generation, we're actually going to end up only knowing a very small number of the people that are in our grandchildren's generation. And so that we end up developing primary relationships, basically with members of our generation and with members of the generation that is immediately behind us and immediately ahead of us. And so what we do is we end up with what they were saying, what Strauss and Howe were saying in a major study that they did at Notre Dame. It's entitled Generations, A History of America's Future. And what they pointed out was that they have done the research, the sociological research, the deductive or inductive, in that case, inductive research that they did just asking thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the United States, tens of thousands of questions. They actually came to the determination that a certain bond develops among the members of 4 generations that exist within a 100-year period of time where they have access to each other. And what they pointed out is that within each one of these 100-year periods, one of the generations takes on a very, very special role, which is the idealists of that century. And that idealist generation is usually born, they begin to be born right at the period in time when a major secular crisis has just been successfully overcome and addressed. And so that this idealist generation begin to be born into an atmosphere in which the milieu is one of growing optimism, that we've succeeded in overcoming this major secular crisis. We're capable, we're competent. We teach our new young children that they can achieve things. They see the evidence of the success that the generation has just had. And they're brought up and they're educated in an environment where they're optimistic and positive and feel competent and responsible. And they share the ideals of that culture because they see it as a successful culture. And that they go through an entire period of their youth bathed in this kind of sense of confidence and idealism. He pointed out that this special generation, in each of the 100-year periods that they studied, going all the way back into 1520, in the earliest period of the people who came over here on the Mayflower and the others, in Jamestown and in the Bay Colonies, the Massachusetts Bay Colonies, they were, in fact, the first generation of idealists. These were the young people who rose up in Europe and opposed the royalist class. These were the people of that generation we talked about last night, and they came over to the United States as young idealists because they had confronted the royalist class and had not yet succeeded in unseating them. So what they did is they came out of Europe and they came to the new continent here, extraordinarily idealistic, and they in fact had a certain set of common characteristics. That the women played a much more equal role in that generation than in previous generations. That the men and women stood kind of shoulder to shoulder in the new country, and there was sister this and brother this, and that they lived in New York and New Bedford and New England, and they were here to build the new shining city on the hill. And that they owned their property in common. They had the commons, and they shouldered the burdens in common, and this is what they did. And each of these 100-year periods that they've studied has had such an idealist generation. And it turns out that, not surprisingly, the baby boom generation is in fact the idealist generation of this century. This is the 21st century, not the 20th century. The idealist generation of the 20th century was the progressive era, those who generated the Chautauqua that I talked about last night. These are the people, the progressives that founded the labor movement and the women's suffrage movement and got women's rights passed and the right to vote and anti-child labor laws and all of that they were the basic early, they weren't socialists. Because you've got to remember, during that period, this was before this whole period from 1890 up to 1915. In fact, there was no communist movement. There was no communist, the Bolsheviks had not overthrown the czars until 1917, October. So that the actual movement that was being generated to oppose all of those unjust structures, the major cartels and Standard Oil and the monopolies and the major businesses and the banking cartels, et cetera, was actually generated out of the Chautauqua movement. We talked about it some at breakfast this morning. But in fact, this idealist generation, the progressive era, was the idealist generation of that period. Okay? And that they in fact were born after the major Civil War, that major secular crisis. They were born after the resolution of the Civil War into that new era of feeling more responsible and competent, et cetera. And they in fact generated a whole set of these ideals. But they did not in fact by themselves implement those ideals. They in fact established an alliance with the generation of their children, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt era, that brought in the New Deal starting in 1932 up and through 1945. That whole era, that was a different generation. That was what they called a classic civic generation, distinct from the idealist generation. And in between that, you have a generation that is born in between that generation, not the children of the idealists, which are in fact the civic generation, that take a whole 21 years to come up into adulthood. before they start to manifest. There's an interstices in there of another generation that is born, which they refer to in that one as a reactive generation, a generation that resists the idealism of the idealists. Under the sway of the earlier generation, reaching past those progressive idealists whom they consider to be furry-headed, troublemakers, challenging the institutions, they reach back into this other generation and they indoctrinate them to be self-centered, materialistic, cynical, jaded people. And that is a reactive generation, which is in the middle. And then there is one final generation that follows the civic generation, which is what they call an adaptive generation. And what happens, what they point out, is that, take for example now our generation. Our generation, the post-World War II baby boom generation, began to be born in November of 1942. November of 1942 was the Battle of Stalingrad in World War II, when the Germans invaded Russia and were stalled out on the fields of Stalingrad in the winter of 1942. And by November of 1942, they had broken the siege at Stalingrad, and the German army was destroyed. And therefore, the Soviets that were allies with the Western Allies in World War II had succeeded in breaking the German army. The United States had already defeated Japan at the Battle of Midway and had destroyed their navy. So everyone realized, as of November of 1942, that this war was now won. It was going to take mop-up, it was going to take a lot of time to get it solidified, but that they had broken the two major Axis powers. And so that all of the people that began to be born starting in November of 1942 into that whole period, into 43, were in fact being born into this kind of rising sense of elan and optimism. To the point, of course, where it came to the peak in 1945, when the Allied soldiers all came home, and there was this huge, massive rush of the baby boom. And so that there's this misperception that the idealist generation sort of started in 1945, but it actually started in 1942, November. So you get the baby boom generation, the idealist generation is born in that 21-year period between November of 1942 and November of 1963, which we all know what happened on November 22nd of 1963. And so you have this period of 21 years of the largest generation in the history of human civilization having been born. In the United States, 82 million people. And people aren't aware of this demographic. You understand that in that 21-year period, there's 82 million Americans born. The entire World War II generation, in the United States was 29 million people. So take a look at the comparative demographics of an 82 million member generation compared to a 29 million member generation. And then you take a look at the generation of our children, the civic generation coming up, who are the millennialists, born primarily in the last 21 to 23 years of the 21st century, and they have 75 million, compared to the Xers that are the reactive generation, which has 42 million. So you look at this, what we're dealing with is a demographic here where we have 82 million plus 75 million. We have like 160 million Americans that are in these two generations. And historically, what Strauss and Howe say is that historically what happens is this idealist generation goes through this process, as I pointed out, where they're all born into this world of rising expectations and a rising sense of optimism and elan, in the sense of can-do. And they then get to be about 18, 19 years old, and all of a sudden they discover that we've been lied to. That all of these ideals that we've been taught, all of these ideals that we've been trained to inculcate, and it turns out they're not really true. It turns out that the generation of our parents really are hypocrites, that they have set up institutions that don't in fact support these ideals. They're doing all kinds of things that are compromised and directly contrary to these ideals, such as we discovered starting in about 1963. In November, when the president was killed, and we said, wait a second, something is wrong here. This doesn't make any sense. You know, this Oswald, one guy, nobody with a political IQ above room temperature believes that. Something's wrong here. And what's the story? They're all drafting us now and sending us over into Vietnam. And they're telling us that we're over there fighting for democracy and fighting for individual human rights. And they're torturing people and killing women and children and burning down towns. And you know, what's going on here? And what we did is we began to say, wait a second, we've been lied to. And the problem was that at that time, the dialectic had set in between the Western capitalist worldview and the communist socialist worldview of the post-October 1917 socialist communist world. And so what happened is when we started losing faith in the ideals, or in the parents at least, the advocates of the ideals, everybody began to think that, well, the only option and the alternative solution was everybody to become kind of a socialist. And so you got this whole kind of underpinning to the movement of instead of moving to enforce our ideals, what people began to do is to explore the kind of rationale of the antithesis of world socialism as really the only viable alternative here. And that's what really happened here. And what's happened, what Strauss and Howe are saying in Generations, A History of America's Future, the report, what they're saying is that this is a pattern that's been repeated every single 100-year period. The idealist generation gets to that point where they get to be 18 or 19 years old, they come out into the world and they discover, lo and behold, they've been lied to. But in fact, rather than abandoning their ideals and becoming jaded and iconoclastic and individualistic and selfish, what they do is they seize onto the ideals. And they hold on to the ideals and they go looking for what the source of these ideals really are. At which point they go to India, and they go to the East, and they go to these different places, and they begin meditating, and they begin imbibing in certain types of pharmaceutical chemicals, actually, and peyote, and other types of things. And that what they're doing is they're exploring into the realm of their unconscious. And they're moving and they're mining and exploring their deep unconscious for the source of these ideals. And so they spend every single generation in the last 4 centuries has in fact done this, that they've gone from this period of, there's a 10-year period in which they rise up against the previous establishment. And they challenge them, not on the grounds of anything other than the fact that they're hypocrites, that they have taught us all of these ideals and they do not in fact practice them. That is the challenge, always. And so the idealist generation confronts the previous generation, goes searching for the source of their ideals after this 10-year period has taken place, because what happens is the previous generation, the established generation, digs in its heels in opposition to the rebellion and begins to hold on to all of their institutions. And they become very aggressive and very assertive and dominating about protecting those institutions. And so they have a resurgence of power, a last gasp effort to hold on to those institutions, until such time as there is a fundamental crisis in those institutions, because they've refused to listen to the criticisms. They've refused to gather in the ideals and amend those institutions to more accurately reflect the ideals, and therefore those institutions go into a state of crisis, which manifests itself in war or economic collapse and depression. And in the face of this secular crisis, as the secular crisis is beginning to come on, the idealists begin to gather together again. And they begin to talk with each other, and they begin to discuss with each other what the discoveries are that they have made in their explorations that have gone on from the time they've gone out into the world. And And they begin to gather together again, and they begin to discuss what it is that they have discovered to be true, what they discover to be the sources of these basic ideals. And they begin to gather together, and they begin to codify what these ideals are and what the sources of them are, and consistently find that the sources of these ideals turn out to be metaphysical. And some people consider them to be spiritual because of the similarity between the realm of metaphysics and what is traditionally understood by many to be the spiritual realm. And what they do is they gather themselves together again, and they begin to look back into the roots of the traditional religious practices. And they begin to engage in certain types of practice, of meditations, of chants, of fasting, of changing their diets, of getting back into an exercise program, of trying to kind of recapture some of the physical stamina of the youthful years. And what they do is, as the secular crisis begins to come on, and they begin to get a clearer and clearer sense of the codification of these ideals and the sources of these ideals, they turn to the new civic generation. And they establish a major alliance. And just as the major participants in the idealist generation are beginning to worry that their best days were back in those halcyon days from 1965 to 1975. And it turns out that, lo and behold, their best days are immediately in front of them. Because as it turns out, it's between the ages of 60 and 70 that the idealists always assert themselves, predicated upon the codification that they have, the recodification that has been undertaken of the source of the ideals. And they reach out to the millennial generation and they establish a major alliance with them as the new civic generation, to prepare the new civic generation to confront and address the secular crisis that is going to befall the culture as a result of the previous established order refusing to listen to the idealists. And that this has happened over and over and over again. And what they're saying is that if you only knew what's getting ready to happen, you would not be despairing at all. Because you would know that what's getting ready to happen right now is the reason we are gathered together here today is because this is the codification discussion. This is that discussion of what are our ideals. We have never let go of these ideals. We have probed and we have explored to understand what the source of these ideals are, to be able to renew our confidence in these ideals, and to be able to reach out and not persuade the established order that they need to change, because we've already tried that. What we do is we turn to the new civic generation, and we establish the alliance to start mentoring the new generation to prepare to address the secular crisis and to, in the face of the secular crisis, amend the institutions, to be able to better inculcate the very ideals that were taught to us by the failed established order. And that is exactly why we've gathered here today, and we are here to begin that process. And so I'm suggesting that if we understand the larger context of this, we can understand that we represent, in alliance with the millennial generation, 160 million Americans, as compared to the remnants of the 29 million of the World War II generation and the 42 million of the X generation, and the ever-depleting number of Korean War generation of that previous adaptive generation of the previous century, of the 20th century. So we are the idealist generation of the 21st century. And our task is to reach out and establish this alliance with the millennial generation, and with our 160 million strong, that we constitute the absolute ruling majority in this country. And we do not need to be powerless. We do not need to be afraid. We need to mobilize and do our work rooted in the very ideals that we have been taught by our parents' generation, and that the time is now. The how we do that is the other 49 questions that we have right here. That they say last night they said you talked about these worldviews and paradigms, and you touched upon 6 of them. But what are they? And how do they? Pardon? The name of that book is called Generations: A History of America's Future, by William Strauss and Neil Howe. And just get our local bookstores to bring it in. They can find it and get some copies of it. And Howe. And it makes for very, very good book circles for talking about it. But the net of it is what I've told you. So they've said is, understand the power position that we're in right now and what's getting ready to happen. And so, yes. No. Oh, yes, I'll do that. I will do that. That's question number 8 right here. That's this question. Okay. So what I want to do is I want to point out for us again. I want us to be working with the same model. So that what I want to do is basically from right to left, I want to kind of visualize a major octave of these worldviews. And what you have here is in bright red. On the extreme right, you have the first paradigm worldview. Okay? And not surprisingly, they move from red to orange to yellow to green to blue to indigo and to violet. And then to clear crystal white light in the 8th paradigm, which of course, as you know, is the collection of all of the colors into crystal clear white light. Okay? And in the first paradigm, each one of these, there's 10 subdivisions of belief structure here. As I pointed out, there is the cosmological belief, which has to do with how the physical universe came into being, the so-called creation story for each of the major worldviews. Then there is immediately below it the teleological question, and that is, given the assumptions you have about how the physical universe came into being, where's it going? What's it doing? Is there some direction that this is all going in? Is there some purpose of some kind of this process going on? The third question, the one below that, is the ontological question. How did consciousness come into being? Out of this apparently dead matter, how does consciousness actually come into existence? More importantly, how did human consciousness come into existence that generated our sense of self-consciousness, out of which the intellect basically flows, which is, of course, our great champion identifier of our species, Homo sapien. How did this happen? And then, of course, the fourth question down is the epistemological question, where they say, what are the means that we have at our disposal as human beings, by means of which we can get access to the data that will actually enable us to answer cosmic questions of that nature? As I said, once you get the answer to those 4 questions within a given worldview, they constitute the 4 pillars upon which the platform of the worldview is based. And that platform represents the philosophy of that worldview. And that philosophy generates its own unique political philosophy. As I pointed out last night, it's the one that most people are familiar with, that runs across the spectrum from red, orange, yellow, green, blue, etc. It runs from authoritarian to reactionary to conservative to moderate to liberal to progressive, to utopian, and then to the new eighth paradigm worldview, which sort of is just the other side of the horizon for us here. And in addition to generating the philosophy, generating its own political philosophy, it in turn generates its own theory of human psychology, thereby explaining the differences between Freud and Jung and the other basic philosophers, or the basic psychologists. There's a whole systematic, paradigmatic, if you will, theory of human psychology that is generic to each of these 8 worldviews. And then there is its own unique mode of spiritual expression. And therefore you get your indigenous, shamanistic mode of spiritual expression, you get your Hebrew mode of spiritual expression, you get your Christian mode of spiritual expression, you get your Buddhist mode of expression, you get your Islamic, Sufi mode of spiritual expression, your Hindu mode of spiritual expression, etc. And what you discover, lo and behold, is they turn out to be the generic manifestations of the spiritual perspective of the individual worldviews. They're all rooted in a certain set of specific assumptions that are made about these major cosmic questions. So this is the cartography, basically, the schematic, if you will, of the realm of human belief systems that we have. And so that those are the world, and you can, as you might guess, you can identify any given one of the worldviews by selecting any one of these categories and naming them horizontally, so that you have the authoritarian worldview, the reactionary worldview, the conservative worldview, the moderate worldview, the liberal worldview, the progressive worldview, the utopian worldview, and the eighth paradigm worldview. Or you could then say you have the shamanistic worldview, you have the Hebrew worldview, you have the Christian world. You can identify them by any one of these, running across horizontally, because it's by comparative analysis that you identify them as how they're distinct from one another. But they're distinct from one another in the horizontal categories. And they're generic within the vertical confines of the worldview. And so if you can identify a couple of these major belief systems, you can figure out what all the rest of them are. And that's why you can't change anybody. That's why you take a person who's a reactionary, and they're all completely crazy about Nicaragua and the Sandinista communists who eat their children. And no matter what you tell them about the Sandinistas, no matter what you show them about their education system and their health system or anything else, just like Pavlovianly trained dogs, all they'll do is jump up and down and lather at you that these are communist totalitarians and they need to be destroyed. And no matter what kind of factual data you give them about the particular, it doesn't change their position. Because the only way to get anyone to change their position on any given one of these public policies is to address their basic fundamental beliefs about their cosmology, about their teleology, about their ontology and epistemology, their philosophy, etc. So that all of these major public debates that go on between people on these different issues never move anybody, because they're addressing the wrong issues. And so what I'm suggesting is that our generation, coming together now as we are on the eve of this upcoming secular crisis, need to address these basic categories of human belief, to try to come to some understanding of what it is that we believe about those, why it is we believe those things, how secure can we be in those beliefs, and what do we need to do if we come to discover that a significant plurality of us tend to, in fact, in our generation, adhere to a sixth paradigm worldview. Why is that? What is it that we really believe about these basic fundamental questions that cause us to adhere to this belief system? And if we do, what need we do to be completely consistent about our belief system so that we can have a coherent set of policies that are all integrated and interrelated, and that they function as a coherent system to tender to people in a completely open and democratic dialogue. And we mobilize members of a plurality, at least of our generation, and a plurality of the members of the millennial generation, and simply vote this into power. What do we need to do? The question, right?
Is there somewhere on your website where you have this whole cartology written out?
I've got it all written out. We have to put it onto the website. What I've done is I've written a draft of a book that's called Paradigm Politics, the clash of human worldviews and the remaking of the American political order at the end of the Cold War. And it's a big 550-page book, and it's got an appendix in it with all the visuals of this, with all the color distinctions, all of the different belief systems of each one of them, etc., that will be designed for a PowerPoint presentation that you can make. And there'll be a disc in the book so you can put it into the PowerPoint and put it up on a wall and show your friends while we're all doing the further codification work that we need to do.
Is it possible for you to briefly go through some of it?
Sure. Let me give you an idea. Let's start with the first paradigm worldview. The cosmology of the first paradigm worldview, what they believe is they believe that there was an original Big Bang, and that the physical universe came into being through the event of a Big Bang. And that at that point, all of the major non-reducible integers of matter in the universe, these atoms, were all brought into being. And what they did is they began to explode out from a centralized place, and they began to disperse out across the expanse of the universe. And that what they believe is that there is an expansion of the universe going on, and that the degree of attraction that all of these integers have for one another is so much less than the impetus that was imposed upon them by the initial Big Bang, that this Big Bang is going to cause them to continue to expand out and away from each other. And each and every one of these is disintegrating. Every single combination of these atoms in the form of compounds and elements and mixtures and planets and stars and star systems, etc., is disintegrating at its rate of atomic breakdown. Every single element is breaking down at its specific designated rate of atomic breakdown. It's a process that they refer to as entropy. And this is the entropic worldview, that everything is expanding out and away from the locus of the Big Bang and disintegrating at the same time. So that there will come a point in time at which every single ultimately non-reducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe will eventually come to a point where they stand separate and apart from every other one. And at the next instant, they will continue to expand out and away from each other unto the point where there is ultimately no thing left in existence. It is an absolute collapse of reality into a state of nothingness, so that the physical universe will disperse out into the farthest reaches of infinite space. Now, that's fairly pessimistic. If you stop to think about it, you stop to think about what the hell's the use of doing anything, ultimately, if it's all going into a handbasket like that. And not surprisingly, that's exactly what they think. And so they think that, therefore, there is no ultimate referent for any kind of right and wrong. That's all that's happening here. And so the only thing that one can possibly do is, in fact, assert one's power and establish control over one's immediate environment, and to assert control through power and dominance. And therefore, you lend some type of order to an otherwise incoherent, disordered reality. A reality characterized by complete chaos and meaninglessness. And they genuinely believe that, therefore, the assertion of that kind of authoritarian power is, in fact, a good thing to do, because it actually lends at least an artificial order to an otherwise chaotic world. And so that you get this descending set of beliefs that the teleological belief, the teleology is this teleology of a complete expansion into nothingness, out of the cosmological presumptions of the original manifestation of the Big Bang. And you get the ontological belief system of them, that is, where did consciousness come from? Consciousness is nothing more than a simple random epiphenomenon of the aimless and incoherent clashing together of these ultimately irreducible integers of matter. It just happens to be a phenomenon that has occurred. It has no particular great value. You know, we're all caught up with our own self-importance, and we think this is all a big deal, and therefore we champion it and extol it. But if you read Daniel Dennett, you know, who wrote Consciousness Explained, he's the absolute paradigmatic ontologist of the first paradigm. It's Daniel Dennett. Get a copy of it. Don't pay for it. See if you can get it some other way. So the bottom line is you get to understand their cosmology, their teleology, their ontology, and their epistemology. Their epistemology is simple enough. The only means by which we have to ascertain anything like truth is through our five senses. Therefore, only things that you can see, taste, touch, or feel are real. And from just those exercises of those senses, you can't tell anything is here except chaos. That it all is ultimately the vast expansion of those faculties, the exercise of those faculties, yields this information. That it's just expanding out into nothingness. And so it generates a philosophy. It generates a philosophy of absolute self-interest. And you get guys like Bentham and others. You know, you get this whole theory that the only values there are in the universe are pain and pleasure. But that's all we've got to measure things by. And so therefore you engage in activity that generates the most extensive, short-term, immediate self-gratification that you can ascertain. And you undertake all actions to avoid any type of personal pain. And that's the mode of ethical reasoning. No, because what it is in the lower manifestation. One of the key things to understand here is that there is a lower manifestation of this worldview, and there's a higher manifestation of this worldview. The lower manifestation of this worldview causes them to recognize that there are certain forces that are going on in the world, like gravity and ley lines, and that you can affect people. You can basically hex people. You can do voodoo. Voodoo is, in fact, the mode of spiritual expression of the lower manifestation of this worldview. And, you know, make no mistake about it, that stuff is real. That there are people who can access that kind of power in the first paradigm worldview. And it's a subset of a shamanic type of power that they have. But in its higher manifestation, you get the classical shamans. You get the high shaman mode of spiritual expression in here. And it runs from an authoritarian political worldview into an authoritative worldview. The mode of the political philosophy of the higher manifestation of the first paradigm is an authoritative one, which is the classic Arthurian model. That you have an Arthurian leader who in fact has the round table and is completely deserving of the kind of authority that they exercise. And you get the high shamans, for example, who exercise that type of authority, in that the entire community welcomes that. They say this person has access to these other kind of dimensions. They know that this stuff is going on, and therefore it generates an authoritative political philosophy. And so that you can see in the example of this particular one here, you see the answers to all of those questions, and you see them manifesting a lower manifestation of that worldview and a higher manifestation of that worldview. Now, you come over into the second paradigm. You come over into the second paradigm now, and they say their cosmology They say, well, okay, we recognize that there was this Big Bang and it's expanding out and away from each other and it's disintegrating at all times. We recognize all of that. But what they believe is that there comes the point in time when every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire physical universe stands separate and apart from every other one. At that moment, there'll be a microsecond of stasis in the universe. But at that point, they believe that there's enough matter in the universe, there's enough units of these inchoate quantum fields, that the degree of attraction that they have for each other at the exact moment at which the impetus imposed upon them all by the initial Big Bang has been spent, that there's enough of a degree of an attraction among them all that it will begin to close back in upon themselves. They'll begin to collapse back in toward each other. And that they will then bond together again, and two or more of the inchoate quantum fields will form a quark, and then they'll join together and form a neutrino, and then they'll form together and form a muon, and that they'll form together and form an electron. The electrons will bond together and form protons and neutrons, and then atoms, and then elements, and then planets, and then solar systems, and then star systems, and then galaxies, and it will then remanifest the entire physical universe. But the universe will be on a track of collapsing back down in toward the center again. And so that in this process, the entire universe will then come back and be collapsing in upon itself like this, to the point where there'll come a point in time at the opposite end of the state of complete expansion, where every single ultimately irreducible integer of matter in the entire universe is in direct physical contact with every other one. And that the entire universe will be the size of the head of a pin. Now, is there a single person in this room that hasn't heard that before? Not a single person here hasn't heard that. Okay? And that is the point at which the polarity, the attraction of every one of those integers will instantaneously reverse itself. And at that point, they will repel, each and every one of them will repel each and every other one. Not simply an explosion from the center out, but that each and every one of those ultimately irreducible integers of matter will repel each and every other one, generating, lo and behold, a Big Bang, another Big Bang, a second Big Bang. As it turns out, not the second Big Bang, one of an eternally repeating Big Bang. Rush Limbaugh. That's a constantly repetitive explosion of gas. What we have here, what we have in the second paradigm worldview, you have that categorically, dare I say, paradigmatically different cosmology. And they have a different teleology. Their theory of what it's doing once it's in existence is categorically different than the first paradigm worldview. And so that you have a cosmological answer and a teleological answer, and the ontological answer to this is that they believe that in fact that consciousness therefore always has existed. Always. And that it in fact manifests itself in the process of the expansion and contraction of the universe. It is an additional third aspect of the universe, along with energy and mass, that always has existed. And therefore you get this different ontological theory and a different epistemological theory. Now the epistemology of the third paradigm is extraordinarily interesting. Because you're dealing here with Hegel. Hegel, who is the dialectician. It's the second paradigm. In the second paradigm, what Hegel is saying is, remember from last night, there is no way that you can get access to ultimate reality at all. All that you can really tell is that this dialectic is going on. That there is this dialectical dynamic going on between a state of absolute mass and absolute energy. And so that everything in the world that has any meaning is relative to the dialectic, that is part of the dialectic that's taking place. And so all that you can really do, all that you can really tell is that you get on one side of the dialectic or the other, and that lends meaning to you. But it's the only meaning that there is in the entire universe, because that's all that's going on. But it distinguishes itself from the first paradigm people who think that there's nothing going on except chaos. So it begins to lend meaning to reality. But the meaning is completely dependent upon your being on one side or another of this dialectic at any given time. And so you're constantly attempting to explore, to ascertain how the dialectic is playing itself out at any given moment in history. And so you get on one side or another of it. And in this particular case we talked about last night, you get on the side of the dialectic that believes that the fundamental material dialectic is playing itself out, is this ultimate struggle between the Übermensch, Caucasian Übermensch, and the Aboriginal people of the world. That's how the paradigmatic dialectic is playing itself out within this part of history. Okay? And so it generates a philosophy. It generates a philosophy of Caucasian state capitalism. Is its basic philosophy. That it's racial superiority and it's social Darwinism, to the point where the Caucasian Übermensch play out the dialectic through the exercise of capitalist skill sets, and they end up controlling and owning as much as possible without any kind of checks or balances. Without any kind of checks or balances on the part of the collective. And so that is the philosophy that gets generated. And it generates a political philosophy, of course, not surprisingly, of reactionaryism. Is that everything is determined by a reaction to the ultimate other. But you have to have an ultimate other. There has to be an ultimate other. If you don't discern the ultimate other, you're not working hard enough. And so if the Soviet Union collapses on December 31st of 1991, by January 1 of 1992, you've got to find another ultimate other. And if you return all the way back to the 19th century philosophy, the pre-1917 dialectic of communism and anti-communism, you return to the dialectic of the Übermensch, Caucasian Übermensch versus the Aboriginal people. And of course, any of the Aboriginal people who try to interfere with the power of the Übermensch are in fact terrorists. Because they're going to be attacking your military people sitting in their property. You know? They're going to be trying to throw you out of their own backyard. These terrorists are going to be blowing you up when you're trying to steal their oil. These people are outrageous. I mean, they will in fact blow up your buildings where you have thousands of people all gathered together figuring out every day how to steal all of their resources and maximize the amount of money they can get to buy more BMWs. You know? So they don't have any trouble finding their targets. And yet, they all look like terrorists. And it's all part of this ultimate dialectic. You are either with us or you are against us. And we will hunt them down in their holes and kill them. And that's how we'll prevail. And so you get the whole second paradigm dialectic, and it generates a fundamentalist mode of spiritual expression in this form of fundamentalist, whether it's Christianity or Islam, for that matter, or for any other. And that's why what you discover is that in the second paradigm, both capitalists and communists are adherents to the second paradigm worldview. They're the opposite sides of the same battle. It's communist versus anti-communist, capitalist versus anti-capitalist. It's Aboriginals versus Caucasians. It's good guys versus bad guys. It's black versus white. And it's constant, just like that. It's good guys versus bad guys, us versus them. And there's a whole religious philosophy that supports it, because what they do is they demonize the ultimate other. And that we are the vessels of light and knowledge versus the powers of darkness. And so the mode of spiritual expression is very specific. So that and this runs across the spectrum. You get to the third paradigm worldview, And you get into a cosmology here and a teleology that ends up, basically you get into Kant here. Kant is the philosopher. You can understand an awful lot of these things. In fact, they'll always want you to teach these things from the point of view of the philosophy. The philosophy is at the core, it's the primal, integrated kind of vision that rests on the platform of the four pillars. And if you get into discussing cosmology and epistemology and these other things, people get really bored by that. But if you get into talking philosophy, only half of the people are bored. And so I don't find that very helpful, discussing all these different philosophies. But Kant in the third paradigm worldview, to give you a quick summation of this, what Kant says, very interesting. This is the factor of the mind. This is where they say, look, you look back over onto the second paradigm and third paradigm, or first paradigm, and whereas the first paradigm people, through the exercise of their five senses, can perceive nothing but chaos. And the adherents to the second paradigm worldview can discern nothing but the functioning of this ongoing perpetual dialectic. If in the third paradigm we exercise the power of our mind, where we can look back upon the patterns that are manifest in the physical data here, and we can actually compute patterns. We can discern through the intellect patterns in this data that transcend the simple dialectic. We can, in fact, discern patterns. We can actually figure out arithmetic formulas of what's going on, and we can turn and project them into the future. And we can therefore project into the future a certain sort of arithmetic formula so that we can say, how would this formula manifest itself 3 steps away? And they look at that and they say, good, let's treat that as though it were true. Let's attach ourselves to that projected arithmetic formula of reality as though it were true and act as a classic existentialist. Acknowledge that it isn't true necessarily at the time, but we can act as though it is. We can attach ourselves to a thing as though it were true, but at all times understanding that you can't really know that truth. One of the things that Kant would say over and over again, we are trapped in our incarnation, and we therefore cannot get outside of our conditioning, environmental or biological. We can only have a relative perspective, but we can use our mind to actually discern first these patterns within the physical data, and we can use our minds to project them out into the future, and we can consciously choose through an act of will, of human will, in an exercise of the intellect to attach ourselves to a projected future, and we can existentially make every single judgment we make as though that were true, and we can therefore, in effect, make it true. We can make this thing become true through an existential choice that we have, while at all times recognizing that we can't really tell ultimate reality or truth. Now, one of the things that characterizes all 3 of these worldviews on the right side of the spectrum is that they do not recognize the existence of a particular faculty that the human species has. While they believe in the 5 senses and they believe in the function of mind, they don't believe in the existence of this other faculty. In the three major worldviews of the 5th, 6th, and 7th worldviews, believe in this. And this is what categorically distinguishes them from those others. And the first place where you begin to get this manifestation is in the 5th paradigm, on the other side of the 4th paradigm middle marginalists. The 4th paradigm middle marginalists are the classic scientific logical positivists, which we'll skip for now. But you get into the 5th paradigm here, and you begin to get Plato and the others who will say that, look, the fact is, we believe, the Stoics have believed, who are the 6th paradigm philosophers, they believe that there is another faculty. There's actually a faculty by means of which we can discern the unitive phenomenon that bonds all of these ultimate units of matter together, and we can hook into this, and we can link into this, and we can make judgments based upon this. And so that, as I touched on last night, the primary distinguishing epistemological belief about what means we have at our disposal by means of which to discern truth is that on the left side of the spectrum, you have a fundamentally different epistemological view. from those on the right. And that is that there's this additional faculty, a sixth faculty, by means of which human beings can experience and directly access unitive knowledge. And that, so that you can see from this more or less brief discussion of these things, that this is how these things unfold. And once you begin to understand what the categories are, and you understand that there are categorical distinctions between the adherence to each worldview in each of these 10 different horizontal fields, you get a full schematic, a matrix, if you will, of the entire realm of human knowledge that falls within this octave. So, of course, the big question comes up is, well, you get it, let's just close with this with the seventh paradigm. The seventh paradigm, which I'll give a little more detailed expression to so you can compare and contrast it. Seventh paradigm cosmology believes that there exists an infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness that exists outside of the physical parameters of the physical universe. So that once you get outside of all the sum total of matter in the universe that is held by an internal bonding phenomenon to each other into this spherical form, hanging in infinite and eternal space, beyond that, infinitely and eternally, is a sea of undifferentiated consciousness. And that this consciousness actually enfolded into being the original precursor unit of matter at the origins of the universe. Unlike the simple first paradigm, well, we don't know, it just was a big bang and it happened. And not like the second paradigm where it just happens over and over and over and over again. It always has been. What they're saying here is that there began at a particular moment an actual, in the sea of undifferentiated consciousness, there occurred a minor differentiation. And flowing between those two loci of differentiation, a wave pattern of relationship occurred that set up a disequilibrium in the otherwise completely integrated field of undifferentiated consciousness. And that this, in fact, began to set up perturbations in this immediate vicinity, generating other perturbations that began to generate the original unit, the actual original inchoate quantum field. And there's long discussions about what that quantum field looks like and what's going on with it, but that the original one occurred in that event. And it enfolded into being the entire material universe. Well, quite so. Not only that there's a whole apocalyptic, that there's an entire teleological purpose for this. Because in addition to that cosmological belief, there's a teleological belief that this started at a particular time, has a particular purpose, and that the entire unfolding of the physical universe is undertaken for a specific purpose. You remember that, the one that you're always wondering about in those moments when you're gathered together with your friends, spending the whole day doing something, and you're sitting there and you're going, oh, why is all this? You know, what is happening here? What's going on here? You know, why are we all here? What's happening? Well, in this, every one of these worldviews has an answer for that. And what the seventh paradigm worldview asserts is that this was undertaken for a specific purpose. And depending upon which one you get into, and in this particular one you take Sufism, for example, the seventh paradigm theistic, because this is the root of theism. This infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness that has no material aspect to it. It's a non-material phenomenon of consciousness that enfolds into being the original precursor unit of matter, which has a material universe that manifests, and that it's infused with consciousness that is flowing from the infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. Therefore, being nothing but a mirage, because it in fact is the same, made up of the same stuff of consciousness that is of the sea of infinite and eternal consciousness. And that this is the one thing that is not a thing among other things. which is the literal translation of Yahweh. And that is why it is an absolute, what they call sacrilege or heresy, to try to put a name to this. Because this is not a noun. This is a verb. An intransitive verb at that. A verb of being that has no active component until this moment of the unfolding of the original precursor unit of matter that is unfolded into being. And depending upon the different theistic doctrines, that this whole thing has to do with two things. One of them is, this thing that we were talking about last night, at another thing after we were all together, is that it appears that in the state of absolute, perfect, quiescent, infinite, and eternal being, the only possible way of improving on that state was to temporarily set up a state of disequilibrium that would play itself all the way out into the material plane and all the way back into non-existence so that it would feel so good when it stopped. Because the only way you can feel better than not being distressed is having been distressed and you're no longer distressed and you feel even better than you did before you were distressed. Now, that is one whole theory of the theistic motive for the incarnation. The other one that we hear a lot about, of course, is the fact that there was originally a creation of these perfect beings of light, the Luciferian being, that in fact discovered that once created by the infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness, was actually capable of full manifestation in the material realm and could manifest material reality pursuant to his own will. Ultimately losing track of the fact that when one is attempting to apply a mode of ethical reasoning as to why you will manifest one thing rather than another and why manifest anything at all, if you lose track of the fact that you are only a function of the infinite and eternal, and that if you try to manifest material reality for purposes that are selfish or for your own power, that you have in fact lost track of who you are, that you've gotten lost, you've gotten separated from the infinite and eternal, and you are pursuing a path of ultimate differentiation in power. And in fact, that occurred historically in a non-material dimension, and that this being and the fellow beings, in fact, got so disattached to the infinite and eternal that they actually lost connection with the infinite and eternal and have lost the ability to ever get back. And therefore, the incarnation of the human species through evolutionary history of moving toward that point in time when we have actually evolved fully into having the faculties by means of which we can not only experientially discern the unitive phenomenon in the cosmos, and that we can make judgments of manifesting in the material plane in accordance with the harmony of the physical universe, but according to the seventh paradigm worldview, that we would actually discern how to manifest as a completely unconditioned vehicle of the infinite and eternal being, as verb, not noun. And that by doing that, we will then have the power of full manifestation, the power of full manifestation in the material realm. And we will then face the ultimate Luciferian temptation, which we see happening now. When we probe into the heart of the atom and we pull out the weapons of total self-destruction and total annihilation of the entire evolutionary process of the human family. When we in fact probe into the genetic pool and decide to start manipulating and controlling and choosing the characteristics and qualities for the future. Not just to prevent horrible disease and pain, but also to just make things more like we want them. more blue eyes, more white people, less black people, less poor people, less ignorant people. And that when we start to do that, we are confronted by the Luciferian temptation. And only by encountering the Luciferian temptation and overcoming it to once again come to realize that ultimately the only proper place from which to make decisions in support of material manifestation in the material plane is as an unconditioned vessel of the infinite and eternal that has incarnated us pursuant to its own wishes, over which we had absolutely no choice ourselves, and we came into being and are into being. And if we realize that, we then can reflect back upon the temptation, Luciferian temptation, and only then can one have genuine compassion for those who fell. And that ultimately the role of the incarnation is to be the pathway of having ultimate compassion for the fallen, who can in fact be only saved by seeing others who have faced their same temptation and have transcended it. It is the only pathway back for them. And therefore you have the entire mythos of the seventh paradigm theistic worldview of salvation for the fallen and the Luciferian fallen at the beginning of all time. And so you see that these are very different worldviews that we have here. And they run the whole spectrum. And the one that we're going to be talking about most, I think, during the process of our codification discussions is the one over here, is the sixth paradigm. Because if we go to the seventh paradigm and we start invoking the seventh paradigm in our access to the infinite and eternal, in casting ourselves as unconditioned vessels of the flow of the infinite and eternal, we are attempting to codify and legislate fundamentally religious beliefs. And one of the things that has been set up in our Constitution, which we'll have to discuss and revisit and determine whether we think it's of ultimate value, is the proposition that one cannot attempt to legislate and put into place fundamentally theistically derived premises. But what we can do constitutionally, I tell you this as a trained constitutional scholar, what we can do is under the sixth paradigm, we can exercise our faculty of intuitive experiential discernment of the bonding phenomenon that bonds the entire physical universe into a unified harmonic whole. And we can make judgments about what is harmonious with or disharmonious to the natural order of the material realm, and we can legislate that. We can make choices about how not to contaminate and poison our environment. We can make choices how not to poison our sea. We can make choices how not to melt our ice caps and reduce the salinization level of the currents in the oceans. We can make all of those choices within the realm of the physical plane with complete constitutional authority. And we can put those choices up to a democratic process. We can discern what those things are, and we can articulate the legislation that would manifest those things. We can put them to our sisters and brothers in an open democratic dialogue, and we can invoke the power of the insight without transgressing the constitutional prohibitions. Now, the fact is that we need to understand that coming with that comes the threat of the Luciferian temptation. That we are the power of the universe, that we have control over the material plane. We are the powers that govern the material plane. But only upon reaching that point of encountering that type of temptation do we have the power to overcome that. Now, this is a very dangerous path we're talking about here. This is a very dangerous path because in drawing to ourselves the power, the authority of invoking the intuitive realm and discerning the patterns that don't have absolute value, but they do have absolute relative power because they're relative to the entire order of the universe. And we'll acknowledge that they're only relative to the absolute universe, but that's not bad. That's not a bad authority to come with. And when you go up against most everybody else, I suggest you're going to come out on top in that one, except for, of course, the others. In the seventh paradigm. And so this is the pathway to the experience of the Luciferian temptation. But you remember that Lucifer was the highest of all created beings, was the great light created by the infinite and eternal, to have and exercise free will in power of manifestation. And it is, in fact, the lot, ultimately, of our human species. This is where we are going. This is ultimately the teleological end point of the evolution of our human species. And is it at that point, of reaching that point, that we come to the apocryphal moment? That, in fact, we are either going to transcend and recognize at that point that we need to open ourselves to the guidance of the infinite and the eternal and conduct ourselves accordingly, or we can go the other way and move to power and self-assertion. And that's, of course, the moment that we're discovering happening here, with this incredible domination of our environment and destruction and poisoning of our environment. They've lost complete touch with the infinite and eternal. What we're saying is, we're not at this point invoking the infinite and eternal. We're invoking the power of natural law. We're invoking the power of the universe to come into us, to open ourselves to the flow of it, and to move in harmony in accordance with it. And this will be, in fact, the salvation dynamic that is inbred in us, it is inchoate in us, and it is, in fact, the task of our human family to identify this, to strengthen this. And we know from the various traditions the various types of practices by means of which we do this, of the meditation and the breathing exercises and the fasting and the different types of sexual discipline and sexual exercises, etc. There's a whole panoply of data around that we know, in fact, addresses this issue of strengthening this faculty. And my point is that this faculty will ultimately be our sixth sense. Out of the sixth paradigm, and we will then open on to our seventh sense, and eventually to our eighth sense. And that there will be one human sense that has direct experiential access to actual phenomena that exists in reality for each and every one of the chakras. And that we will then be fully evolved. At which point we will move through the eighth chakra into the next octave of being on the non-material plane. And then you break into the realms of the non-material. But as the great sages say, you don't have to worry about that today. Okay? What we have to worry about today is we have to worry about all these others. We have to worry about how to get all of these other worldviews elevated from our lower manifestations into our higher manifestations. Not, in fact, trying to convert a third paradigm person into becoming a sixth paradigm person. What we're trying to do is just be of assistance in facilitating a third paradigm person in becoming a higher manifestation of the third paradigm. And for example, in the second paradigm, getting a person who's an adherent to the second paradigm in its lower manifestation of dialectics, materialist dialectics, to evolving into the Tao. And seeing that it's not a confrontation between absolute opposites like that, it's a manifestation of the Tao. That in fact there is a binary relationship between things that are apparently opposite and different, but there's a binary unitive relationship. It's a triune relationship that generates a unity out of two apparent opposites. And that is the pathway. That is the pathway to elevation. And when our people have elevated into the higher manifestation of each of the 8 worldviews, then they in fact can dialogue across the top in the higher manifestations of these worldviews through this faculty, this intuitive faculty of communion, which in fact manifests itself through ESP and telepathic communication. And that's the pathway that leads us to opening onto the 8th paradigm and opening onto the 8th chakra. And this is how we open the 8th chakra that gives us access to the potential. Because the 8th chakra, just like do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, the second do is the first do of the next octave of sound. As we open onto the 8th octave, or the 8th paradigm, we end up being in the first paradigm of the next octave of being. And what we do is we then transmute from Homo sapien to Homo divinus. And that is the quest. That is the undertaking of the human family, is to move through this progression and not destroy ourselves, not blow ourselves up out of our attachments to the delusions that we have, until we come to this spot of opening onto access to the next octave of being, which is, I dare say, where we will encounter some of the extraterrestrial intelligence that function at a vibrational frequency that is distinct from ours, which is why they flash into existence and out of existence and can go beyond the speeds of light and do all those kind of things. So there's 2 questions. No, but that was the first big question. The people want to have this thing kind of basically explained. And
so where in this cosmology is the great mystery triangle not function in your understanding?
In other words, the question as to why we're behind the veil. That it's interesting because only by coming out from behind this veil, it's the great challenge. My eldest son, Danny Paul, is constantly saying this to me. So what is the story here? Why is it that we're behind the veil? Why aren't we just told this? And it has to do, I think, with having to, in a sense, replicate the blindness into which the Luciferian beings fell out of touch. Because if we don't come from a place of blindness, then we'll never have any compassion for how they could possibly have done what they did. We never forgive anybody for doing anything other than things we've already done ourselves. And then we can forgive them, because I understand that. I see how you could have done that. But things that you couldn't comprehend doing, when they do those, you say, I can't comprehend how a person could do something like that. And you demonize them, you set them up as an ultimate other, and you do not have ultimate compassion for them, and you do not love them unconditionally, and you do not save them, because you do not forgive them. So it's that imposition of this kind of temporary experience of blindness upon us that gives us access to the compassion that we need to have in order to truly forgive. I suspect. Okay? So, They say the history of political philosophy that you expressed last night, where did this come from? Well, actually, this comes from basically all the information that we've all had. Basically, there wasn't anything that I basically told anybody last night that we haven't studied in world history courses and Western civilization courses, etc. That it's really a matter of being able to discern the patterns in it. The data is all there. And what you have to be able to do is stand back. It's just like that. It's just like that thing with all of a sudden there's this moment that you kind of shift and you kind of have a different take on the same data that's always been there before. And there it is. And how could I not have seen that before? But it's that all I'm saying is that over the years of in the different places that I've been, in different positions that I've been in, etc., when I was actually asked by President Gorbachev in the State of the World Forum to direct the the strategic initiative to identify the new paradigm. I mean, here I was with 2,000 major world presidents and secretaries of state and secretaries of defense and stuff coming in, and I was kind of put on notice of having to figure out, help figure out, what in the world could possibly be explaining how people could have such different points of view on things and not be able to hear each other. And so I began to hearken back to the stuff that I had studied in divinity school under Ralph Potter, who was the chair of the Department of Comparative Social Ethics at Harvard and was the social ethicist for the World Council of Churches. And he was a protege of Dr. Talcott Parsons, who for years, 26 years, was the chairman of the Department of Sociology at Harvard. And they discuss some of this stuff. They point out that there are these different worldviews. They don't have all of them in there. And they surely don't understand anything about the chakras. In the energy centers in the body, they're not into that stuff. But they understand that there are these different worldviews. They just don't understand what all the necessary component beliefs of them are. And so what I did is I began to work with these models, with Talcott Parsons' model, and working them up into, in a sort of a sense of challenge of being in that position that I was in, of trying to figure out what type of a common schematic could we work with, and talking with all of these people that in fact valued each and every one of the worldviews, and demonstrated that we could answer the questions about each of the different belief systems without denigrating it and saying, I see how you have this position. And I have a different position on that, but it's really because I have a different position on this up here, to try to get them to address these issues, the fundamental issues, so that they could actually dialogue with each other. Because it wouldn't do us any good to be caught in the same kind of position of the people like trying to convert a reactionary to believe that the Nicaraguan Sandinista government is okay. That doesn't do any good. We've already experienced that. We can spend forever on that. So we were trying to figure out how to get to fundamental enough sets of beliefs that we could actually be dialoguing about something of real meaning, so we could get the leaders of the governments to agree to direct their attention to trying to address some of these things. For example, attempting to put enough funds into the space program to try to determine whether or not there was an adequate amount of mass in the universe so that it was likely that it would in fact stop expanding. The minute you get to that one, then you, without anyone knowing it, you've undermined in a really fundamental way the cosmological premises of the entire authoritarian worldview. And so lo and behold, you've taken away one of the major pillars supporting authoritarianism in the world, rather than bombing them, or bombing someone else because you are them, And so that's how we got to this. But it was in fact just probing and analyzing the pieces of history and data that exists. And for the most part, there are only very, very, very rare occasions on which you will ever hear me say something that you didn't know before. Just a few points or times. Like this piece of information about the United States Senate. And, that's kind of an esoteric piece of information you don't necessarily hear often. But virtually all the other stuff that I've ever said, you've all sat right there and heard it before. In world history courses and civilization courses, etc. So it's not from any surprising place. They say the biological faculty of intuition. In what physical manifestation is this occurring, and how does it present itself? And in what way might you suggest that we seek to achieve this faculty within ourselves? Well, I had recommended last night that you take a look at the book, The God Gene, by Dean Hammer, the director of the Genome Structuring Project at the American Cancer Institute. He discusses this in great detail, and that it's a funny thing because let me tell you another little story. I recommend you read that book to get an idea of how it manifests itself in the kind of material plane. But there were a set of studies that were done back in the late 60s, 67, 68, at the Downstate Medical Center in New York. What they did is they gathered together 7 of these holy guys. They got a shaman, and they got a rabbi, and they got a monk, a Catholic monk, and a Sufi, and a Hindu faker. They got a number of these 7 guys together, and they brought them to Downstate Medical Center, and they set up a little booth like a little telephone booth there. And they had these cilia, these tiny hair-thin threads of cilia that were able to discern really microscopic voltage differentiation over space inside this booth. And they hooked these guys up to electroencephalograms and electrocardiograms, and they had one of these little clocks that was down to the thousandth of a second, et cetera, and then they had little film cameras in there. And they said to them, okay, look, one by one, we want you guys to one of you go into this booth and do that thing that you guys do. So what they did is they discovered that all 7 of these guys, that each one of them, as they went in, they would go into the little booth, and they would either kneel down or squat down or sit down in a lotus position. They get into a position where their back was completely erect. The first thing they would all do. The second thing they would all do from their completely divergent traditions is they would start to sing or chant or pray, and they would repeat the same chant over and over and over again. And this resulted, in fact, thirdly, in each of them coming into a state where they were expelling the air from their lungs and then fully inflating their lungs in accordance with a specific ratio of the amount of time they spent exhaling and inhaling. And it was almost identical, even though they had completely different chants and prayers. And the fourth thing that they recognized is that as a result of that, the alpha emissions that they were picking up through the electroencephalogram were starting to become more and more pronounced in all of them. And the fifth thing that started happening is that the bioplasma around their body, the kind of aura of energy around their body, started energizing. And it was actually emitting voltage differential to a greater and greater extent out around their body. And then the sixth thing that happened is that they discovered that they were tracking the electromagnetic field that was being generated by these people, and they discerned that in each and every one of their cases, the actual center of the electromagnetic field that was being generated and surrounded their body was inside their body. It was inside by their solar plexus, under their heart. It was inside them, the actual physical center of this field of energy that they were generating. And that this energy field was pulsing in a very slow way outside their body. And then the seventh thing that they discovered is all of them is that the pulse rate of the energy field around their body fell into absolute sync with their heartbeat. And they sat there, therefore, in the center of a self-generated electromagnetic field of oscillating energy that they were generating. And all the scientists were saying, what the hell is that? What is this? What are these people doing? And what they speculated ultimately was that these people in this particular state functioned, the physical technology of their body actually functioned like a crystal set, like a radio receiver set that could actually resonate in harmony with the electromagnetic vibrational frequency of this bonding phenomenon that bonds the entire universe together into one unified harmonic whole. And that it basically closes the circuit when they're in sympathetic vibration like that, so that the data which is contained in that unified field flows into these people, so that they have a direct experiential way of knowing in a nonlinear, non-rational, non-intellectual means the data that exists inside the universe. So what I'm suggesting to you is that this is how it manifests itself. It manifests itself in a certain technology like this of the human body with the energy fields around our body that can be, in fact, directly accessed and affected through certain types of historically learned methodologies. And what Dr. Hammer has discovered at the American Cancer Institute is that there is a particular gene. Now how he did this, it was interesting. He was given all this tons and tons of money to try to track a genetic source for cancer. And so he got to access the interviewing of like 1,000 different people whose genetic codes they got a hold of voluntarily and could then in fact track their genetic codes. And what they wanted to do is to find out those who had signs of cancer or had cancer in their families or other, they would break them into different demographic groups, then they would examine their DNA and see if there was in fact some particular gene that seemed to be more dominant in those who got cancer, or if there was some other gene that was more dominant in those who had no cancer at all in their family. And he said, I'm getting to do this, he said, I might just as well check out this other issue of spirituality. He said, this is a very peculiar issue about some of these people seem to be very spiritual and have all these spiritual experiences, and there are other people that are basically borderline spiritual troglodytes, and I don't understand what's going on around here. Maybe there's a gene for this, he said. And so he did. He started tracking through it. Well, he's doing all of his day job of looking for the cancer gene. His night job was looking for this other little thing, this other little spiritual gene. And it turns out he found it. He said, it turns out that without any question at all, there is this one particular gene that, in fact, it gives off a chemical. And that it actually gives off two chemicals in different directions. And if it gives off more of one chemical, the people begin to have, as I mentioned last night, it causes an effect in the body that causes a major inflow of blood into the frontal lobal cortexes. And it's the frontal lobes. And it, in fact, depresses the blood flow into the reptilian parts of our brain, the cerebellum, that has to do with your sense of physical identity and personal individuation and all that. And it tends to suppress that. And so that there is an increase in the frontal lobe activity of perception and conceptualization and artistic pattern discerning. And so that these people end up having an experience where they feel, as he said, that the universe, and they would answer these questions because they had a whole bunch of questions. He put a bunch of questions in these 1,000 questions they had to answer about spirituality. Are you affectionate to people? Do you think the universe is a friendly place? He put a whole bunch of these things in there. And then what he did is he found this absolutely direct correlation between the people who answered all of those questions in the way that indicated a kind of a spiritual life that they had with those who had this particular gene that generated this particular chemical. And what he discovered is that, as I mentioned last night, this particular chemical, which he called it VMAX2, I think, VMAX2, he's named it. And he said that what he discovered is that this chemical, which has got this big long name to it, is given off naturally by the human body when a human being ingests peyote, or if they ingest LSD. He said, and the body itself generates this other chemical. So that what he's really suggesting is that the chemicals that are in peyote, for example, the lysergic acid, which is one of the 28 active ingredients in peyote, that what that really does is it doesn't cause the mystical experience itself. What it does is it stimulates this other gene. And it causes the gene to give out this natural chemical in the body that actually causes this kind of an experience. And he went on to point out that he wanted to make it clear that he was agnostic with regard to the issues, the ultimate issues of whether there's an infinite, sea of undifferentiated consciousness and all these other things. But he said that this seems to be the biological manifestation of the spiritual experience. And he said, look, it doesn't mean that it wasn't implanted. It doesn't mean that it wasn't designed into us to enable us to have this kind of evolving thing. But the bottom line is he believes that this is evolving in the human family in a way that is teleologically increasing the excretion of this particular chemical in the body of human beings, therefore strengthening the frontal lobes and suppressing the rear lobes and causing us progressively and teleologically to be more and more and more spiritual. Now, I find that to be good news, And so what you're really seeing is, when you read Teilhard de Chardin, if you've read him, Teilhard, who was a major Jesuit paleontologist, that was actually tracking the evolutionary processes of the human species, Teilhard de Chardin, who was a Jesuit priest, actually wrote about this and talked about his belief that there was this teleological evolutionary process going on in human beings that had a biological basis of the spiritual experience. And for that, he was ultimately condemned and prohibited by the Catholic Vatican, the Committee on Orthodoxy, from ever being allowed to speak publicly or to write at all. So what he did is he weekly wrote long letters to his sister, who kept them. And when he passed away, she ended up publishing them. So I would recommend to you, those who are interested in this issue of the biological interface of evolution and the evolution of spirituality, might want to read some of Teilhard's work, Teilhard de Chardin. And, but also, you should get a hold of Dr. Hammer's book and take a look at that, because there are, now what this is this makes it extremely appealing to people who are primarily fourth paradigm scientific rational positivists, who are ultimate materialists, where they're saying, oh, great, I get it. What's happening here is it's just a gene. You know, they don't say, where'd the gene come from? You know, or how come we got this gene, or any of that stuff. They say, oh, okay, I get it now. And it's okay. Fine, I'll take it. You know, we'll take it. We'll have all kinds of great fourth paradigm scientific logical positivists start to understand that this faculty of discernment is actually happening. And so that we'll get them ultimately through the epistemological question to shift over into becoming at least fifth paradigm adherents. And you get one of those rare experiences of them not just moving from a lower manifestation to a higher manifestation, but they will actually move a whole category. Now, so that's the physical manifestation. Now it says, what particular practices do you do to develop your God gene? And do you believe in God? And if so, define God. Well, what I do is, you know, I fly on airplanes a lot. I eat terrible food on the airplanes. I stay up really late. I work all the time. No, but actually what I do is that I encountered this personally, I might add, that the joke I made earlier about the tea is what happened to me. Is that I was talking about this last night, I was actually taking my final exam at Harvard Law School. I had completed my Harvard College and my Harvard Law School degree, and I was sitting in a place up in Magic Mountain, Vermont. I had gotten a take-home exam to take for my final Harvard Law School course, because I had been designated by Professor Abe Shea at the Harvard Law School to be one of the point briefers to the United States Senate, to go down to brief the Senate on the Cooper Church Amendment as to why it was constitutional to cut off all military funding for the war in Vietnam. And so I'd gotten this special designation, so I was offered this opportunity to take a take-home exam, because it was right in the middle of the exam period in 1970 when I was asked to go do this. So I'm sitting at this place up in Magic Mountain, Vermont, and I'm typing away on my criminal law exam, and my college sweetheart, as I pointed out last night, one of the two women in my life that I've loved. The other one is Sarah Nelson, my wonderful wife of 26 years. And Esther came over to me and she said, would you like some tea? And I said, well, you know, I'm not into tea. You know, it's got caffeine in it and all that stuff. And she says, oh, no. She says, this is herbal tea. And I said, okay. So I'm typing away, and she brings the tea over, and I'm drinking the tea and working away. And the exam started getting kind of easier and easier. I started going, whoa, oh, okay, I see this. And so all these kind of trains started coming into the station at the same time. And the bottom line is, I realized that I was majoring in constitutional law and knew everything basically about the Constitution. And I said, look, at the criminal law exam, all you have to do is just suppress all the evidence through one constitutional means or another, and whoever the defendant is going to walk, right? That's all you have to do. So I began doing all that. I'm typing away, and Esther comes over and she says, Danny, would you like another cup of tea? I said, well, that was a nice cup of tea. I said, sure. So she brings me another cup of tea. So I sat and drank the other cup of tea, and I finished the exam. I'm sitting there in a beautiful, gorgeous place in this big kitchen with butcher board tables and copper pots, and May 30th of 1970. You know, sun shining in through the windows, big grass waving out in the fields. And I'm all done with the exam, and I'm sitting here going, wow, this is cool. I'm all done with Harvard College. I'm all done with Harvard Law School. You know, I've got a position at the #1 law firm in the entire world on Wall Street, you know, to go down to be a big lawyer down there. And all I got to do is for 6 weeks go to Europe and get to go see some friends that I'm going to have there. So I went, boy, this is really kind of a moment to relax, which gives you some idea what a wonk I was up to that point. And so I'm watching this stream of golden sunlight coming in the window, and it's shining into the tables, and there's these dust particles floating in the golden ray of light. And I reflected upon it just a moment. I said, isn't that amazing? It's like sitting out at night beneath the stars and looking up into the Milky Way and seeing the stars like dust in the sky. And instantaneously, I fell away, completely out of time, back to the point where I was 4 years old, sitting on the floor in Gansevoort, New York, which is about at the exact same latitude as Magic Mountain, Vermont. And I was 4 years old, and I was watching this golden ray of light coming through the window, watching the dust particles, and I for the first time, struck upon how similar that was to all those stars that I could see sitting out in the yard at night. And so I was actually experiencing that very same insight again at the age of 25 in that moment, the exact same insight I had at the age of 4, and I had fallen completely out of time back into that moment. And then 10 seconds later, I came right back, and I'm sitting in the place in Magic Mountain, Vermont, and 25 years old, Harvard Law School, and I said, that's quite remarkable. But the more remarkable reality that I experienced at that time is that the unconditioned consciousness from which I had experienced that initial insight was absolutely identical. After all the experiences, after all the learning, after all the training, the basic, absolute witness was exactly the same. And I was completely astonished. Now, I had a pretty good estimation of myself at the time, and to find something out like that was so profoundly different was completely amazing. And at that exact moment, I heard this going on behind me. I turned around, and there's Esther and her husband, Joe Durham, and Martha, and they were laughing. And she said, Sheehan, you are such a wonk. A wonk is W-O-N-K, it's no spelled backwards. It's that thing of a person who just does a big grind that just studies and studies all the time. You're such a wonk. She said, we just gave you 2 of the biggest hits of LSD that we've ever seen, and you sat there and finished your law exam. You are incorrigible. And so I said, oh, gee, I said, that's interesting. That must explain this really interesting experience that I just had. And I explained to them the experience. And I was telling about this last night. So I said to myself, well, what do you do? I said, it's done now. I never would have done that in 100 years. I got this mind I have to control and protect. You don't want my mind going crazy. And so I said, but okay, it's done now. So what do we do? Do we eat good food? Do we listen to music? What do we do? She says, no, you go outdoors. You go outdoors. So they slid open the big doors, and we all threw our clothes off, and we went running out into this shoulder-high grass, and we're running around out there. And I went out and laid down on this big boulder, this great big warm boulder in the middle of the field, and was lying there completely nude to the sky and watching the clouds flow over, and then realizing that it was in fact the earth rolling under them, kind of rolling under the ocean. I was just sort of getting these little insights, and a little woodchuck came up to the side of the rock and looked up over at me like that, and I looked over at him, and at first he went, whoa, and then he went, oh, wait a second. He said, this seems to be kind of all right. And he came up onto the rock and lay down on his back like that, right next to me like that, and he was laying there looking up at the sky like that. So I said, there's something going on here that really bears some looking into. And so I basically, from that point on, began meditating and became a complete vegetarian and did all this kind of stuff, and ended up going on to Harvard Divinity School to start studying this stuff. Because once I realized that there was really something to this, and then you start reading Meister Eckhart and all these people, and you look at it and you say, wait a second, these people know. You start reading that stuff and you say, these people know. They know exactly what that experience was. And so down beneath all of this stuff, there's this fundamental experience that is at the root of all of this. That's what they're all writing about, what they're singing about. It's what all the poems are about. This is what it's about. And then I got directed toward reading Sufi poems and Rumi and the others, and you start to say, a lot of people know about this. This is really an open secret. This is, in fact, what they're all talking about. And so I ended up becoming chief counsel of the Jesuit National Headquarters and their social ministry office, and getting to meet the Pope and getting to meet the Father General of the Jesuits and getting to be their lawyer and doing all of that stuff. And so it is. So what I do is simple meditation. You meditate for 20 minutes in the morning and you meditate for 20 minutes at night. It's not like you should meditate for another 20 minutes in the middle of the day. that I stopped eating meat for all that time, but I eat fish and stuff now. So it's not a big personal thing. A person asks me a question, I'll tell you, but it's not. That probably 95% of you in here are a lot better at any of this than I am. But in fact, our generation knows that this stuff is the issue now. So what we've discovered that there's a whole set of practices and things in here that in fact are very, very important. I've established a sexual discipline. That Sarah and I have been together for 26 years, and actually from the moment I saw her, that I, in fact, have never been to bed with another woman in my life. And it's just that we have this thing, that there's this bond between us, and we have two wonderful, terrific sons, and that my feeling toward women is that I love women and have sisterly relationships with women and stuff like this, but it used to be quite different. Before I'd met Sarah, before I started doing all of this, that I was like a lot of other guys, who would figure out whoever the most attractive woman was in the particular place. I ought to get to know her, for the weekend at least, and it was all that kind of stuff. I don't make any pretenses that having been very elevated, and not particularly elevated now, but there's a certain sexual discipline that is extremely important for one to understand. One's eating habits, one's sleeping habits, the meditation that one does, etc. But on a scale of 1 to 100, I'm still in the single figures. Really, and you guys all know what the differences are. There are people who are extraordinarily evolved beings, and with regard to this, that are in the high double figures, and we know who they are, and so that's just the answer to that. They say that, do you believe in God? Well. That's a funny one. They always used to laugh about that at the Jesuits when someone says, gee, are you a Christian? You say, well, I'm a Jesuit. So there's what I think is that I think that the seventh paradigm worldview, I think that my own personal opinion is that it's probably correct that there's an infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated consciousness that abides, that exists outside of what we perceive to be the physical parameters of our universe. And I do believe that our universe was enfolded into being at the behest of this infinite and eternal sea of consciousness. I believe that each of us has at the center of our consciousness a nodule of this same unitive, unconditioned consciousness. It is the witness. It is the place from which we perceive the golden rays of sun and the dust particles like stars. And I believe that setting aside all of the terrible history of the institutional religions and the Catholic Church in particular, and the Christian Church in general, and the other churches, I might add, in synagogues and in temples and ashrams and all the other stuff, all of the imperfections that we engage in as human beings along this path toward this ultimate objective that we have are impedimenta to us, but they also contain the seeds of knowing. And they become the houses for people who want to make this the center of their lives. They support them, they give them the sustenance, they give them access to the writings, etc. So it's a mixed message, like all of us are, each of us. And so that's my understanding of it, that when people say, do you believe in God? That, as I said before, the infinite and eternal sea of undifferentiated being, which is not a noun, cannot be given a name. And to name it is to specifically demonstrate that you don't get it. And so you'd have to say no to an answer like that, to a question like that, and therefore cause the person to be completely confused. And so you don't want to do that. And so what you say instead is, let me tell you what I do believe. It's like classic lawyers, when they ask you a question, you say, look, let me tell you what I believe rather than answer the question. Okay, and so that's basically what I believe. But I do believe that there are fundamental and profound constitutional problems, as I said before, in attempting to implement theologically perceived values in our particular constitutional system. And for that reason, I think the sixth paradigm operates as a much more acceptable constitutional model for us to function from, and that we can therefore update natural law, which is at the root of this entire worldview, by integrating into it the newer insights from quantum physics and that I mentioned last night in the studies and stuff of Dr. Hammer and others. And that if we can then resuscitate natural law and raise it back up into an esteemed and respected position, it can in fact be the underlying source of authority for this new public policy movement. So could you give a short overview of what the heart connection is to all of this? Now, that's, of course, that's the heart chakra. The heart chakra, in the fourth paradigm, interestingly enough, it's strange. People say, well, how can the heart chakra be at the core of the fourth paradigm if it's scientific logical positivism? But if this is the paradigm of the Christian worldview, the fourth paradigm, at least ever since the year 1000, the First Vatican Council, when Thomas Aquinas basically succeeded in convening the First Vatican Council. And what they did is they basically extracted all of the mysticism out of the major Catholic doctrines and infused it with Aristotelian scientific logical positivism. And Aquinas succeeded in doing that. And so therefore, they adopted the kind of classic scientific logical positivist attitudes of Aristotle. And Aquinas, in fact, just before he died, he was blind by that time, and he had this huge mystical experience, right in a month or so before he died, a huge mystical experience. And he said, oh, gee, all this stuff that I've done my entire life is rubbish. He said, all of this logical, positivist categorization, all that kind of stuff, is just rubbish in light of what I now know. But of course, the church doesn't talk about that. They talk about all of his stuff prior to that time. And so that, but at the center of the Christian tradition, of Christ himself, that I believe that Christ was, in fact, a mutation. That he, in fact, had this faculty fully evolved, was born out of time, like all mutations that occur in the course of evolution, that a number of mutations occur way ahead of time and are into an environment where they aren't sustained at that time, but the mutation continues until they actually have developed a capacity to survive in a given environment. And I think that Jesus, in fact, was a fully evolved, he had this faculty fully evolved. He had an energy field that was highly energized, which enabled him to do all of these extremely interesting things, to reach into the core and transmogrify matter, which he could. And he could, in fact, levitate and elevate and walk on water like he could. People go, oh, that's really strange. But it's strange, but it's what happens. And that he had these particular charisms and capabilities. And that's why he said things like, it's not so important what I say. It's what I am. You need to know what it is I am. And if you know this, and if you know, as you're sitting here, that the stuff of which this bread is made is the same stuff of which my body is made, then you will know who I am. And that he, in fact, walked among the people, and he told them these things. There were events where he had the transfiguration, where he, in fact, showed the full light of his body, the radiant body, and all that kind of stuff when he showed with the three guys on the mountain and stuff like that. But the fact is, there are prophets around. The prophets of the great traditions and minor traditions have demonstrated this. There are mutations like this around that have occurred. And that is why he is the good news. Like the other prophets, it's the good news that this is coming in the human family. If we can simply avoid destroying ourselves by ourselves, then in fact this will take place. This is unfolding teleologically. And as long as we get out of the way of it, it will occur. Now, I believe, like he has pointed out and others have pointed out, that you can in fact turn and address this in your own individual life, and you can accelerate the actual development of this particular faculty right within your own lifetime, so that we can accelerate that process. Just like you could accelerate the ability of your hearing. You could actually sit in a room and turn a radio down one whole notch every single day for a month, to the point where you could sit in the room in a state of meditation. You can hear the radio that nobody else can hear in the room. It's just, you can do that. We could in fact today make a pact that 1 year from now we would gather again together here, and we would all run a 26-mile marathon. And that if we addressed that every single day between now and 1 year from now and got ourselves into shape, we could run a 26-mile marathon together. So we have the capacity, by turning our direct attention to our own physical capabilities and our faculties, to basically empower these faculties. And what this is this thing, that there are these people who are mutations born out of time, ahead of schedule, and they are the message to us. They are the prophets. They are the good news, telling us that this is on the way. And if we learn from that and we see that and we turn our own attention to this, to strengthening this, we can in fact accelerate the process by means of which our human family will come to the eschaton. And that is one of the things about the seventh paradigm. It is eschatological. It's an eschaton. There is a coming of fruition of this, which, as I point out, I believe that is the point where we will in fact evolve into these faculties, and we will open our eighth chakra, and we'll open on to the next octave of being. So when people ask me, whether I believe in God or whether I don't, that's what I believe. And I believe that therefore the heart, etc. You see all the pictures of Jesus, you see them with a big heart, with the big light rays shining out of his heart all the time. These great big things, the light out of his hands and out of his heart and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's because people know that that's what this is. And Mary is the same thing. And in this fourth paradigm, the means by which we will elevate from the lower manifestation of the fourth paradigm, the mode of spiritual expression of Catholic scholasticism, we will elevate up into the mystical traditions of Catholicism through Mary, the feminine, through the incarnation of the divine feminine, because we need to understand that Mary's the one who gave birth to this guy, And even according to the teachings of the Catholic Church, Mary was in fact, quote, born without original sin, which meant that she was born in a state of complete unistic experience. So she's the other human being. There are only two of them around, according to them. Now, there's a whole bunch of other prophets and stuff like that. But the fact is, once we can get to understand that these are partners, and that she is in fact the co-redemptress of the human family, then what we're going to do is we're going to elevate the Christian tradition up into its higher manifestations of mystical realization, and that the heart chakra will be opened. And if we can get the heart chakra open of all of our people, it will start then opening on to the higher chakras in our bodies, because we can't get to the higher chakras without going through the heart. And so that's what I believe. Now, this brings up, it says, you said that the Catholic Church appointed kings during the first 1,000 years of Western civilization. Do you feel that the church at that time actually had the awareness and the integrity to choose according to such divine inspiration rather than simple politics at the time? Interesting question. I would say it was both. I would say that the actual undertaking was originally undertaken to identify genuinely spiritually gifted beings, because it was directly in their interest to do so, as long as their interests were spiritual. But as the interests of the Catholic Church became more and more political and economic and others, they in fact began to mix those judgments with those other considerations, and they began to pick people who had those charisms rather than the spiritual charisms, and paid the price for it, I believe. But I believe that ultimately, initially, it was the intention to do that. It says, it says, how do you account for the power paradigm you described last evening over the last 2,000 years as being in alignment with natural law when women's contribution to the human family had been so thoroughly undermined? That this is the blind spot. This, as I point out, is the blind spot. That the avenue to the higher manifest. A little secret here. The avenue to the higher manifestation of every single one of these worldviews is through the empowerment of the divine feminine. That is where it's going to open onto the full partnership of taking in the intuitive and the spiritual dimension. And that is the pathway to the higher manifestation of these worldviews. And that's why at the New Paradigm Academy in Colorado is the first of the buildings that we're going to be building is the temple to the divine feminine, representing the fourth paradigm. And that will be the center from which the entire academy will be built, which I'll touch on a little bit before we close here. So now there's a whole series of questions having to do with specific policy issues Well, they ask here, for example, what are your thoughts about John Hagelin and the Natural Law Party? It's interesting. They have potential. The problem is that the Natural Law Party is totally parochial, under the control of the Transcendental Meditation movement of Maharishi Mahesh Yoga, and that they can't get out of Iowa. You know, I mean, I went and sat down and had a whole meeting with their whole executive committee and stuff like that, and said, you ought to establish a genuine natural law party. You ought to set it up in California and Washington. You ought to do this whole thing. You know, and they basically said, well, you know, basically, if it's not here in Iowa, we won't have any control over it. I said, that's exactly the point. And so, you know, basically, they didn't get it. But the basic premises of the Natural Law Party, that Natural Law Party, are basically benign. They basically understand the power of meditation. They understand this realm, like a lot of other major faith groups do. But they're too attached to controlling the thing. So I think we have to have a completely independent natural law movement, public policy movement, and they will in fact come in and participate with it, but will not have any kind of dominance or control in the movement. Is there such a thing as a natural law lawyer? And is there a school for this? And how can I learn more about this? The answer is yes and no. There is a natural law school that the Transcendental Meditation people have, that the TM people have, but it's very much a TM type of school for TM trainees and lawyers who do TM, which make them better than probably lawyers who don't do TM. But it's not really a full natural law school. That one of the things that we intend to do at the New Paradigm Academy is we intend to have ultimately a natural law school, just like a natural law medical school, in a natural law school in the different areas of science. And so let me just touch on this. That we were supposed to go till about 5 or so. 4, I got carried away. But the bottom line, let me give you a little description. We talked about it at breakfast. How many people were at breakfast this morning with us? 1, 2, 3 or 4. But it's, with my apologies to you, let me just explain a little briefly to folks. So then we'll have some more spontaneous questions if you want, and then I'll let you go at 5. When's the World Series game on? Does anybody know? Is it at 5 o'clock? Okay, I'll let you go at 5 o'clock. Okay, because I'll probably want to go see it too. The bottom line is that what we're talking about doing with the New Paradigm Institute is there will be 4 locations in which the New Paradigm Institute will be. One of them will be in Santa Cruz, down south in California, in Santa Cruz. That is the New Paradigm Project. The New Paradigm Project will be responsible for the public education and grassroots organizing about all of this and the stuff that we're talking about. We will work through like a Chautauqua movement to revivify the old Chautauqua movement that existed in the 1890s, to confront the major transnational corporate capitalist oligarchies and monopolies, etc. And we're going to do it through a major mobilization, first in the 55 congressional districts that are represented by members of the Progressive Caucus in the United States Congress right now, that's chaired by Dennis Kucinich. And then we're going to move on to moving into 110 states that are those 55 states plus 55 states represented by the liberal Congress people, and then into 110 congressional districts in the following year, and then in the following year 220, and then in the following year 440 of the 443. And so that's going to be a grassroots organizing public education campaign that will be extremely interesting, and I would recommend that you who aren't familiar with the old Chautauqua movement, familiarize yourself with it. And you will see, as I mentioned, this was the source of the women's suffrage movement, the American labor movement, the environmental movement, all of the major movements that were undertaken to kind of counterbalance the power of corporate oligarchy in the country. And so we will revivify that process, and it'll be a public education grassroots organizing operation, pursuant to which we in fact set up major tents where we have people come in and there's singing, and there's reading poetry, and there's essays and talks, etc. like went on in the Chautauquas. We'll have Bonnie Raitt will be working with us. Bonnie has done lots of concerts for us in the past. Jackson Browne, Springsteen has done concerts with Chris Christopherson, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and we'll probably get a number of others to come and work with us. A lot of the people that you see out now running around on the campaign trail, basically agreeing to do this even for John Kerry. But they'll do it with a little bit more enthusiasm for the new paradigm. And then there's going to be the place where the research will be done. That's going to be dealing with all of this stuff and writing the papers and the essays and fleshing all of this out in great detail over and above the initial book about this that just sort of sets it forth. The research will be being done at the New Paradigm Institute, as distinct from the New Paradigm Project in California. The New Paradigm Institute will be at Harvard Divinity School, probably at 20 Bryant Street in this major building that they're offering to give us to do this. And we'll do the research and be sharing this information in the world of academia to actually attempt to impact the teaching of philosophy and the other things from this perspective in the midst of 306 colleges and institutions of higher learning that are all around the Boston and New England area. So that we'll be at the center. We're not going to let go of the old world. We're going to try to bring this information to the new world and integrate it into the scholastic setting. The third installation for the New Paradigm Institute will be the New Paradigm Academy. The New Paradigm Academy will be in Crestone, Colorado. And we have been given 40 acres of land and promised another 40 acres directly contiguous with it by Maurice Strong and Hannah Strong. And that is where all these big monasteries are, where Sri Aurobindo has the monastery and Babaji has the monastery. There's a Shinto monastery and a Buddhist monastery and also the Karmapa is going to be coming there to live when in fact he gets out of house arrest in northern India with the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama has property actually immediately next door to us. And so they've given us this property, and we're going to be building the academy there. The 80 acres together have 8 major hills on them, all in this kind of spinal column formation. And what we're going to do is we're going to build a building on each of them to represent each of the worldviews, synonymous with the location on the spinal column of the chakras. And that we're going to have a full manifestation of teaching of the different worldviews, complete with all of these different categories, which is kind of a scholastic undertaking, but also the mode of spiritual expression, the music, the art, etc. And we're going to bring in 100 children, 100 members of the millennial generation, between their graduation from high school and their senior year, before they go off to college or go off out into the world, and to have 50 women and 50 men come in, and we're going to have the whole year of study preparing them for entering into the world and saying that, look, you're going to be getting all kinds of information to you about, well, this is the way reality is. No, this is the way reality is. But you got to understand, these are just different worldviews. You need to understand what these baskets are. And we're going to prepare the people for that whole year. And that'll be a 1-year educational process. And as time goes on, we'll develop it into a 2-year associate degree. So they get a 2-year associate degree in these courses, eventually into a 4-year college. And then we'll generate a law school and a medical school and an architecture and music school and physics school, et cetera, like that. Because actually the valley is 4,000 square miles in this valley. It's the headwaters of the Rio Grande River in Colorado. 14,000-foot mountains on 340 degrees all around the valley. And it's got the Great Sand Dunes National Monument immediately next door, et cetera. But it's a fabulous place, and that for all of those who are interested in participating in this, that you should contact us through the website, which is newparadigm.org, the newparadigminstitute.org, and we'll get back to you on this thing. And the fourth installation will be in Washington, D.C., which will be the New Paradigm Public Policy Institute. Because at base, all of this has to translate into actual concrete public policy alternatives. What does this look like as an alternative taxing scheme? How are we going to pay for these programs? What kind of medical system are we talking about? What kind of educational system? What kind of defense system? What kind of public energy system are we talking about? All this will be done. That'll be a 501c4. The institutes, other institutes are all 501c3, tax-exempt, tax-deductible organizations, educational organizations primarily. This institute would be a 501c4, which is an advocacy group, which means that it's tax-exempt, the income contributed, but it's not tax-deductible for people who make the contributions because we're attempting to impact public policy. And eventually it'll have to generate probably a new paradigm political party eventually to implement these basic values around the world, so that we'll end up having representatives that are representatives of the new paradigm, and they'll be in the Congress and in the state legislatures and in Congress or in the mayor's offices, et cetera. So that's what this thing is going to look like. So when they ask, how is this going to manifest itself, this is what it looks like. At the present time, we have the promise of the offices in Cambridge. We have the promises of the land in Colorado. We have the office in Santa Cruz. And we know what the building is that we want to have this in at 120 Maryland Avenue, right next to the United States Supreme Court building, across from Congress in Washington, D.C. So that's what's happening on this thing. That I really appreciate the time to get to spend with you on this. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions here. That we need to, I'm getting signs from everybody, but people's eyes are blurring over. So we have a couple additional questions just so we have a little live interchange here before we all leave. Yes? They just get a hold of Jordan over at the Metaphysical Library, and they'll have copies of this, which they'll make available.
A lot of your comments have been kind of U.S.-centric in terms of what's happening and what's going on.
Yeah.
With the 4 generations, everything.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Do these comments apply outside the United States to the world, other places, China?
It's interesting.
We're a small part of the world.
Yeah, we tend to be in an inordinately influential part of the world. That, I mean, given the fact that we're the kind of engine of a lot of the difficulties that are going on right now, as we realize that we represent the 6% of the population of the entire human family that can actually do something about this, about these policies. And so that for that reason, I'm focused on this of our trying to mobilize here to do, because my experience has been in the Jesuits that, you go down to Latin America, you go to Africa, anywhere, they say, go home. Go home and deal with your government. You get your government to stop doing this stuff, and we'll be okay. Just get them out of here. So we actually actively engaged in 1976 to get the Carter administration to agree to cut off military aid to all foreign governments that systematically violated the human rights of their own citizens. And by 1979, the Shah of Iran had fallen, and the Somoza fell from power in Nicaragua. So that it is in fact U.S. centered. This thing, because I want us to mobilize to try to lift up some of these bad policies from people around the world. Strauss and Howe are looking into at the present time, taking data now to look at other countries to see if this pattern still obtains. It would tend to be likely to do that because of just the biophysical reality of the fact that these 4 generations, that you don't really know or associate with people in the other generations. So there's some kind of a relationship that gets established. They're trying to determine now whether it tracks this particular kind of relationship. So they're going to be doing additional work on that. Okay? So let's do one more, and then we'll be right at 5 o'clock, and I apologize for the overdoing this thing. Okay?
Is your speaking schedule on the Institute's website?
It will be, yes. Yeah, the whole thing will be there. I have to go down, and I got some stuff I need to do between now and the election. And then on the day of the election, I'll be back in Santa Cruz to vote. And then I'll be doing a major presentation at the Esalen Institute on November 3rd, briefing the staff at Esalen and their board and everything on the results of the election. Then we've got a major weekend at the Esalen Institute that Ken Wilbur and Amory Lovins and a bunch of the folks that are major people that are associated with the Esalen Institute are going to be coming in to have a discussion about the post-election kind of activities that need to be engaged in. So I'll be there, and then I've got another couple things coming up, and they're going to put them on the website. Because we're going to be basically in 2 different worlds. Depending upon what happens at the elections, I'm fully engaged in planning, for the victory that Kerry and Edwards are going to have, and I'm planning my proposed speaking schedule, et cetera, in accordance with that. But they didn't want to post it all on there in case we had to change it at all. So it'll be there. It'll be there on the website. We'll be doing. You got the videotape here, the videotape of last night. This ought to be enough to overwhelm almost anybody. Thank you. Oh, yes. I think it's very important that the Republicans, I was down in Florida last week and in Texas both, and it turns out that the Republicans are in this massive overdrive I've got these big red, white, and blue buses going all around to old people's homes and stuff and dragging them into having them vote early, that they're doing absentee ballots and stuff. And that, as I understand it, in Oregon, which is one of the swing states, going to be a very, very important state, that they've set mail-in ballots that everybody can have here. And that's right. And the fact is that if you vote now, there's no reason not to vote now. If people start to vote now and start sending them all in, and you follow it up with news stories of how the people in Oregon are all voting now, they're all getting in the vote, you'll start to generate a whole lot more people doing this and signing those things and sending them in. The fact is, you'll get more people to vote over a period of an entire week than you'll get to vote on one day, because people will forget it, they'll get something wrong. So if you can generate that as a real news event, or they refer to in the news as a real event taking place, you can get people to vote, and you get more people to vote. The more people vote, the more votes are going to be cast for the Democrats, and the more likely that this is going to be won. And Oregon can affect the entire outcome of the election in the country. Yeah. So it's an important tactical issue to engage in. So I would suggest that when you go home today, what you do is you dig out that ballot and you actually vote, and you send it in and start doing that. And then what you guys should do is coordinate with with John and some of the other people, some of the news media people, to contact the other media people, have them contact the Board of Elections and ask them, are you getting a whole lot of votes coming in? Are people starting to vote? Make that a real news item. And when they say, yes, yes, we are, you take that to the other news media and say, here's what's happening in Oregon. The people are coming out in numbers. They're all voting. It's happening now. And if you can direct some national news attention in here during the course of the week, then Oregon can be perceived as the state that did it, that actually saved our country and pulled this government away from the control of this administration. Okay? Thank you very much for coming out. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.